Howdy, everybody. Welcome back to 584 Vetoes, the tariff-free podcast manufactured right here in the good old US of A. I'm Tom Church.
I'm Danny Heil.
Today, we're trying to figure out what the heck reciprocal actually means. Danny, how you doing today on this bloodbath of a market morning?
Trying not to look at my portfolio, I suppose.
Did you fail?
Although
Did you?
I mean, it's kind of fun, actually, as long as you don't need the money, near term,
In
It's
the
a
long
buying
run.
opportunity.
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
Oh God, but buy. Although I don't know. The real question is, how long do these tariffs, these announced tariffs, actually last and stick around? So, what are we talking about today? Yesterday, President Trump showed up in the Rose Garden, I believe it was the Rose Garden, with a couple big poster boards and announced reciprocal, I say in quotation marks, tariffs on almost every country in the world. I want to verify. I don't think Russia got a tariff, by the way.
So
Which is
apparently the countries with a lot of sanctions were not did not face any tariffs just because the argument was we don't need to because it's essentially an infinite tariff.
But noted enemies, Japan, India, the European Union, basically every other country in the world
As a
received
weird
very large
looking
tariff
up.
rates.
I happened to look up the Falklands and a 41% tax on the Falklands of all places. So, which is kind of like, yesterday was the anniversary of the start of the Falklands War. So
That's true. That's true.
Just
For you history buffs out there.
bad day for them, April 2nd.
Yeah. So here's the thing. These are not reciprocal tariffs. I've been in touch with my more, what do you want to call them? Uh, uh, center of the country friends who don't care about politics, who think Trump might not be so bad, and they genuinely ask me like, well, are we just tariffing other countries what they're tariffing on us, like what their tariff rates? Explain, Danny, what's actually happening here.
So, I mean, it's a little unclear, right? What they're actually doing and how they've derived these numbers. What it seems like they're doing, a lot of the focus, particularly on the European countries, are using the value-added taxes border adjustments as a sign that somehow these countries are behaving protectionists or protectionism. And the reality is what a value. So the administration's argument is that when a good is produced in Germany and brought to the U.S., the amount of the value-added tax that Germany would have taxed on it if it would stay in Germany is rebated back to the exporter when they send it to the U.S. And so the administration looks at that and says, well, that is clearly protectionism. They're subsidizing the importation of goods into the U.S. and leading to, making it harder for our domestic manufacturers to compete. And meanwhile, when our domestic manufacturers produce a good and try to sell it to Germany, then they levy a value-added tax on that good when it's imported into Germany. And the reality is that's a standard border adjustment type system where effectively what they're trying to do is make sure that if I'm Germany and I'm a German citizen, I should be paying the same tax on that good regardless of where it was actually made. And so these are standard consumption taxes, the same way that if you're in California and you have a sales tax in California, all the goods that you buy in California, regardless of where they were made, faces that same sales tax. That's what the border adjustment taxes does. And so it is trade neutral. It shouldn't affect trade. In fact, it makes sure there's a level playing field regardless of where the good is sold. And so the reality is the Trump administration is just looking for reasons to raise tariffs, right? That's
but not every country has a VAT, has a border adjustment tax. I mean, that's on in addition to the calculation that they made, which they said were reciprocal, when in fact what they actually did was look at a country's trade deficit with the United States, the level of the trade imbalance, and divide it in half and say that's the rate. It has nothing to do with the actual tariff rate on imported
but they're
goods.
pointing to these different things of these border adjustment changes. They're pointing to, what they perceive as currency manipulation in these countries. They're trying to find, actual rationalizations for this policy. And yes, I think you're right. The reality is, in the same way that FDR picked the price of gold as $21 because he liked the number 3 or something like that. This is the same sort of logic as that, and I think we should be at the same time. I think the haggling over the rates. There are some really interesting price effects of this, right? Like if you're UK, are you happy today? Because your rate's only 10%, and so are you actually benefiting from this? Right. So the rate variations actually could lead to some really strange trade effects that I don't think the administration has really anticipated.
I don't think that they've anticipated much. I don't think that they thought this through. I mean, let's get some actual numbers on here. Here are some numbers of countries that the tariffs claimed by the United States that they have. And again, this is just based on trade imbalances. South Korea, 25%. Their actual average tariff rates maybe above 6. Canada, 48%. Average actual tariff
Mhm.
rate, maybe
Well, remember
4%.
the Canadian and Mexican tariffs have
Yes.
nothing to do with that has everything to do with Canadians flooding our country with fentanyl.
Uh-huh, yes, and if
Mhm.
they would only pay tariffs on that fentanyl, we'd be fine. Vietnam, 92% actual average tariff rate, around 9.5%. It's
Mhm.
it's kind of just astonishing. I mean, this is let's also remind people this is a tax increase on Americans that the president is just unilaterally doing. Now, I need to know, Danny,
No, oh, wait, so hold on.
okay,
So yeah,
not
I mean,
it was given the authority back in the day. I get
well,
you.
no. I'm going to quibble with whether or not I think it's unambiguous. Americans are going to pay higher prices for goods.
Yeah.
The size of the tax increase, it's always interesting to me. I'm very much opposed to tariffs. I want to preface that with that, but it is interesting to me that why do other countries care if American consumers actually pay the full top of the tax? There must be some incidence levied on
Yes.
exporters, and the
Oh,
reality is
sure.
that the whole
Yeah.
world gets hit by these taxes, right? In one
Yeah.
way or the other. Foreign exporters lose money. Consumers in America certainly lose money. The only people that benefit are domestic manufacturers and workers in America who don't work in industries that rely on foreign inputs, which is a pretty narrow, small group of folks. But they might really benefit from this. Like there are those folks, and then we're budget people, and so we should talk about like, will this raise much revenue? And I find it really interesting. The administration's very eager to say, oh, we're going to raise. I think Navarro had a $6 trillion number over 10 years.
Mhm.
And like, well, wait, if you get that money, then that means you're not helping out American manufacturers at all, because that means that we're continuing to import these goods and we're just paying a big tariff on them. So, like, which way do you want it? Do you want to support American manufacturers, or do you think this is the way to balance our budget?
Also, the United States has gone to a service-based economy. We're quite rich for it. Does everyone wanna go back into manufacturing? Do we want the workforce to go to 70% manufacturing? Is that what we want? Like, what are what's the
But like,
optimal
isn't
industrial
this an
policy?
Office episode where Michael and
Yes,
uh,
they all have to go
yeah,
work in the warehouse when the warehouse
no, no,
team
they
wins the
no, they get
lottery.
in an argument over this, and Oscar says, "Well, don't you think the service economy is much more important than 21st century
Yes.
than manufacturing economy?"
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, I think from Trump's, like, from a narrow political viewpoint, right? This is what he promised. This is and he looks at the American Rust Belt and says, this is going to improve it. Now, I question whether or not that's actually the case. And if you're in Ohio or you're in Pennsylvania, like, are the factories going to come back there, or like, are they still going to go to South Carolina and Florida and other places, right? Like, it's very unclear to me whether or not, like, even the people we think we're going to help from this will be helped.
And I wanna do the whole, counting of this because, okay, so you put these big tariffs on and you think, "Okay, well, now we have to manufacture stuff here." But if the economy tanks so much that you don't even get the investment in new factories, firms, investments back in the States, there's a level of you could increase the cost so much that the benefit doesn't even come close for the targeted group that you're trying to help, right? I mean, we look back at like the steel tariffs, and the estimates there were the cost per job saved was like $700,000 a job, and ultimately, if it saved, what was it, 30, 40,000 jobs, it cost a whole 800,000 jobs on the economy as a whole. So I mean, there's this level of like, okay, if you only look at the pros for certain people, you could be like, oh, that's a positive. But the actual accounting needs to look at everything else and could dwarf even the people you're trying to help.
I mean, yeah. I mean, go back to Econ 101, draw a supply and demand curve, put a tax on it. You have a deadweight loss, right? You have some inefficiency from goods not being produced that are valued more than they cost to make, right? And that's the reality with any tax. And it's particularly a big reality when you have a tax that, like, leads to large distortions, right? And tariffs are an example of where we think that, just the way the market behaves here, you could expect to see very significant distortions in this. And that $6 trillion number is essentially that, no, there's no distortions. Consumers in America will just, pay higher prices for these goods. Or I guess they would say that, importers into the country will pay these prices and not raise their prices at all, or pay the tariffs and not raise prices at all. Right. So I mean, no question. I think the accounting of this is kind of uh, not done well. We'll say, charitably. But I do think, there are real benefits to select groups of people, and, like, for those folks, like, I think they perceive at least that there's these benefits to it, that these foreigners are eating our lunch and we need to do something about it. And I am pretty clear as a consumer that I'm better off by having free and open trade, and I think 99% of American consumers are
I
going to
was
be
gonna
worse
say,
off.
like,
But there's going to be
I
a
wanted to put
subset of workers who look at this, and if you're like UAW, you're like, yeah, this is good for us in the long term. That if all of a sudden people have to build cars in America, that we're better off for it. I mean, you look at and it could last for a very long time, even if we get rid of some of these tariffs. I mean, like the chicken tax. Do you know what the chicken tax is, Thomas?
remind me.
So back in like the 1960s, the Europeans had levied like a big tariff against
Uh,
American poultry. So we weren't able to export American chickens. And so in response, the Johnson administration, I believe, levied a 25% tax on light duty pickup trucks. And even
yes.
though I'm pretty sure we export poultry to the Europeans now and things like that, we still have a 25% tariff on light duty trucks. This is why you can't buy a Toyota Hilux in
Right.
America.
Right.
You're stuck buying American made. You can't buy the Mercedes trucks that the Europeans have, Volkswagen trucks, all these ones that are made overseas. It's just prohibitively expensive to buy it. And so, like, these things have long term consequences. And UAW has benefited from the chicken tax for 50 plus years. So there is a
Meanwhile,
case to
every
make that.
consumer in America has not, right?
Yeah, I
That's
mean,
the
yeah,
other
unless
side of the
you're,
economy.
yeah, exactly. That we're all missing the great Toyota Hilux truck, which is the every terrorist's favorite truck in the Middle East.
It
Yeah.
lasts forever. All right, so Danny, I wanna know what they're thinking. What are they actually when I say they, the administration, what are they trying to achieve? I'm hearing like, "Well, we're gonna make other countries back down." Bill Ackman says this morning, "Sometimes the best strategy in a negotiation is convincing the other side that you're crazy." And the White House has just said, "This is just the start of negotiations." But, I mean, these are tariffs leveled on every single country. I don't think that there's a specific ask of every what are they actually hoping to achieve here?
So I think it. I mean,
Okay,
one
revenue, I guess.
one revenue. I think there is this idea that we can get a bunch of money out of this. Two, they do think that if you maintain tariffs, you'll have a boon in domestic manufacturing. And I mean, I think to probably on the margin and the direction of that is probably true, right? You will have more incentive to invest in the U.S.
Sure.
Or to build your factory here in the U.S. and things like that. And then they just kind of disregard the consumer, right? And so, like, if you disregard the consumer entirely, remove him from this, or believe that somehow only the importers and exporters are going to actually pay these taxes, you can do an accounting like that and probably see, yeah, the benefits do exceed the costs. But this is what Donald Trump had promised during the first administration. He backed away from it, wisely so. And so he's delivering on a promise to his constituents who are the Buy American type of folks. And so I think we need to be mindful that the politics of this. We'd like to think the politics are just so bad that like in a week from now they're gonna go back and not do it, which might actually be like worse, right? If the Trump
Yeah.
administration continues to go back and forth on this, right? You can make a case that these tariffs are level changes, right? That we're just all of a sudden 5% poorer than we were before, right? Because these tariffs are just have made America poorer.
Mhm.
But if it's all of a sudden that we don't know what these tariffs are going to do in the future, then it's a whole lot harder for businesses to plan. It's a lot harder for consumers to plan and all of those things. So, there's a case to make that having at least a consistent approach allows the market to, adjust. And it's not a good adjustment. It's we prefer not to have to make this adjustment. But now that we can make this adjustment, you can make a case that going forward, and maybe this is the administration's case, is let's do these now. Let's have this big wealth shock that affects everyone, and then we can slowly grow our way out of it. And in a year from now, people aren't going to be like, well, gee, I'm 10% poorer than I was when Trump entered the office. They'll be, well, I'm 5% wealthier than I was 2 months after Trump entered office, right? And so maybe that's maybe people are thinking it's the first derivative of their wealth is what matters, not their actual level of wealth.
That doesn't work for me. All right, what you and I don't want these things to happen. I wanna know what Congress can do about it. So some recent news, the Senate just voted with 4, I think, GOP senators to take the Canada tariff abilities away from the executive. I just read that Senators Grassley and Cantwell have introduced legislation to require congressional approval on all new tariffs within 60 days. Tariffs are a Section 1 article, sorry, Article 1, Section 8 power that Congress has ceded to the executive based on some statutory legislation, a couple decades ago. I want to know what
Several
Congress can
decades
do
ago.
about it. It's the Senate and Finance and Ways and Means, right, are the ones that could look at this and pull it back.
A united Congress could do all of those things, right?
Yeah,
But ultimately, you need to have a and not just a filibuster-proof majority, and you need to get the House involved, but you also have to overcome
a
a
veto.
presidential veto,
Right.
right? And so that is an incredibly tall order that I mean, given the politics right now, like I can't imagine you have enough congressional Republicans, even if they're very concerned about what November 2026 looks like for them, that
Yeah.
they'd be willing to do that right now.
All
They'd
right. So
much
that
rather, I imagine, they're working back channels, being like, hey, you can't do this, and but ultimately, the on the front, they're going to be supportive of Trump,
how
right?
bad does it have to get 16, 14 Republican senators to say, all right, we'll override the veto? How bad does this have to go?
You'll have to ask those 16. I can't tell you, right? I mean, you look at the
Give me
Trump's
some metrics that
nominees
we
and
can
you look at
track in
some of
the
the folks that
future.
got through the nomination process that were really
Yeah.
surprising to the political prognosticators. And, it seems like for perhaps very good electoral reasons, Congress is not going to be, the congressional Republicans are not going to be willing to stand up to
I'm
Trump
just worried about
publicly.
what it would take to do that and how long it would take because I'm thinking, okay,
Mhm.
you need an enormous recession. You need what? Some stagflation, lots of unemployment. You need some sort of fiscal crisis to
Yeah,
really
and I
push
think
that far.
all those things don't move Congress enough, but they might move the administration to say, "Oh, we're gonna get some sort of political win out of this. We're gonna extract something that we can point to that
Right.
EU
Well,
has
we meant
compromised
this
on,"
all
and then
along, right?
yeah, and then it becomes a negotiation. I mean, Trump has said this is not a negotiation. These are going to be permanent going forward and things like that,
Which
and
is
one
funny
that I
because the administration again this morning just said
yeah.
we are going to begin negotiate. This is the beginning of negotiations
Yeah.
with all these
What
countries.
and getting back to that, I do wonder it's a weird strategy of let's pick a fight with everyone else at the same time, right? If like, at least for the first Trump administration, they were targeted on these things. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. Very much tit for tat. You can negotiate under those sort of things, but if you're just saying every country in the world we're going to levy these huge tariffs on you, much easier for them to gang up and Germany. I think the some leader in Germany had just said that we're going to work with our partnering countries and we're going to make sure that the response is felt by Americans. And so to do it all at once seems like a really bad strategy if the goal is to, really negotiate away protectionist policies. But I don't think that's the goal. I think the goal is we're going to we're going to increase domestic manufacturing at the expense of American consumers, and we're going to be happy about it.
How about the Federal Reserve? Supposed to be independent. What's its reaction to enormous market uncertainty? These tariff rates. What are we looking at the Federal Reserve and hoping that they do?
Well, I mean, I think putting aside all this, I think the Federal Reserve has made pretty clear in the last few months that the rate reductions that maybe they were hoping for a year ago probably aren't going to happen.
Hmm.
And when you introduce tariffs into it, tariffs, the price increase in tariffs isn't inflation, right? You got to
Right.
the
It's a
technical
little
distinction of
yeah, a little
you don't have
substitution. Okay.
a increase in the price level, you have a change in relative prices, right?
Right.
And so, but at the same time, if the Fed is looking at the PCE, the price index, and saying, gee, that's not falling, right? And maybe they're like, well, that's inflation. That's not actually, monetary driven. They're going to be very reticent before moving rates. They already are reticent, and this is going to make them even less inclined to actually lower rates in the event of, rising unemployment, risk of a recession, all of those things. So, then you have the 1970s, right? You have stagflation of high interest rates maintaining, rising prices, and high unemployment. And that's a recipe to lose a lot of congressional Republicans in 2026, I would
No
imagine.
kidding. Commerce Secretary Lutnick this morning made the claim you're going to see employment leaping starting today. So, I think it's always helpful to ask, how would we know if we're wrong, right? We have these strong opinions on whether we should do these things or not. We think that they're going to have strong negative economic effects. So I'm trying to list out what we would expect to see if this were negative. And I mean, we'll look at the working age population. We'll look at the employment population ratio. We'll look at unemployment levels. We'll look at all of it, right, and see what this leads to if it actually happens, right? I don't think that this goes into effect literally today. I think I was
The
reading
6th, I think 3 days from now.
something like that. I'd also read the Flexport
Quite the
guys were
birthday
saying,
present, Thomas.
I know.
Quite the birthday present for you.
The Flexport guys were saying if they could get stuff on containers by the 9th, I believe he
Hmm.
said, maybe it
Yeah,
was 6th, maybe it was the 9th, then they don't go into effect on those goods, and so they're just like they're
a
working
mad
over.
rush. Yeah.
Yeah, it's 24/7
I
until
was
that
looking at a few
happens.
things on Amazon today of like, I'm going to maybe just buy these today. So before,
So that's
prices
that's
can
where we're
change.
going to see it. That's where the average
Um,
American's going to see it, right?
yeah, but Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there is a part of this that, I think one of the reasons why we're just seeing broad-based across the board tariffs is that it's actually really hard to do like targeted tariff policy unless you have, your commerce department with all of your trade folks ready to go.
Mhm.
And I think actually the fact that this is so broad-based in part reflects the fact that it's easier just to say every good that comes to the US faces this tariff, right? As opposed to saying this is, line of goods gets this tariff and kind of more targeted approach like they did the first administration. They just don't have the civil servants ready to go to administer that kind of system this time around. And so if they would have waited a couple months, you probably would have got a more targeted approach, and perhaps that it would have been a better
Well,
indication that they're really eager for negotiation as opposed to just like pick a
yeah.
fight with the world.
And I mean, these tariffs, they've closed the de minimis loophole, not loophole, but rule, which is tariffs don't apply to really small, what you say, low price goods. And it's just so you would think that like really cheap stuff isn't going to get affected, but no, it's on.
But that and the cheap goods are what the wealthy buy, so that shouldn't have any effect on the poor.
Exactly. Now that's, I mean, your sarcasm is noted, right? But
Thank you.
it's going to affect everything. Every normal everyday good that you
Yeah,
buy
I
on
mean, you see,
Amazon or Target, everything
Dollar
which is
General is
manufactured
way down
overseas.
today. The
Is it?
dollar store,
Oh
I think it
yeah,
was Dollar General, one of the dollar
yeah,
store ones, way down today because it turns out not many of those goods are being produced in the U.S.
yeah.
And again,
Oh,
that's going to affect mainly Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos on their regular trips to Dollar General.
they're just like you and me, Danny. Um, Big nerds. All right. Well, that's tariffs. We will follow along with this because I imagine there are going to be lots and lots of moves happening quite soon. Let's talk the status of the reconciliation bill. There's still a
Which
lot
one?
that needs to happen congressionally. Let's talk. Maybe the Senate budget resolution just came out. I'm not
Mhm.
pleased with it because I think it's adding, what was it, $5.8 trillion to the deficit.
But they're raising $6 trillion in tariff revenue, Tom. It's deficit neutral practically.
Uh huh. Again, I want to point out that if we reshore and manufacture everything in America, there is no tariff revenue. And if we get that $6 trillion in tax revenue, then the tariffs have been for nothing, and we've just raised our taxes $6 trillion. I mean, the tariffs are taxes. This is the biggest tax increase in decades, Danny.
I mean, in terms of, I don't think we've ever had a tax increase that maybe outside of like a wartime where they as a share of GDP,
Yeah,
right? This is a 2 percentage point increase in GDP essentially is what this would work out to be in revenue, right? So the party of small government is given a whole lot more money to the Beltway today
indeed. All right, so the
if
Senate
they
budget
succeed.
resolution, what was it, $3 billion in cuts is all they've mentioned,
Yeah,
something along
and
those lines.
to their credit, right? I mean, like these reconciliation bills, what actually ends up in them, very different. But yeah, the goal of this was like we need to move the ball forward. We want to have something that allows our committees to start writing rules, and we don't want to commit to a specific spending cut number because we think it's going to be really hard to rate. And at least they're being honest, right? I feel like the House budget, where they're like, oh, we're going to get $2 trillion or $2.5 trillion in budget cuts. I think you look at that and you say, well,
Well,
challenging.
challenging, and also they are backing away because everyone rightly noted that of the, $2 trillion, $800 billion or so was only going to be able to come from Medicaid if they weren't touching any Medicare things based on the committees that they assigned the spending restraints from.
Yeah.
And they've just gotten killed on that. And so we're not even going to get, I think there'll be, if anything on healthcare, to be very minimal. And healthcare for the Republicans mostly these days is just to pay for, right? And so I don't think they're going to get that much.
Well, I mean, I think they're going to play a budget game, right? So they're going to, I mean, all reconciliation requires is that within the first 10 years or after the first 10 years, right, you can't add to the deficit. And then even in the bill, the resolution actually has like, spending cuts by year and things like that. But the reality is what matters for the House Budget Committee is that top line number. So are they going to get $2.5 trillion in savings over 10 years or, in cuts? you know, Scheduling a cut to Medicaid in 4 years from now is politically fairly cheap today, right? That,
Mm.
you can do that and you can say, oh, we're going to introduce work requirements and get rid of provider
Sure.
taxes and all those things 3 years from now, or,
Mhm.
on January 1st, 2029, right? And then it's, two Congresses from now. That's their problem. And so these are kind of like budget games they play all the time. So at least, the Senate is saying we're going to do those things, but we just don't know what those look like yet. So we're not going to say them. So, I think It's much like the president's like proposed budget that comes out every year, right? You take it with a grain of salt. Of we know that none of this is actually going to materialize in the way that it looks on paper right now, and we know that a lot of these things are going to be pulled back. The question for me is, gee, if they're really saying they want to reduce taxes by 5.5 trillion, like that means that's more than just extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs
Right.
Act.
More.
That's doing something on overtime. Eliminating the SALT caps that were one of the big parts of the 2017 tax
I
law.
heard rumors that they were going to push it up to $25,000
Well, yeah, I
from the
mean, and
current thing.
whatever they do, they're going to get rid of the marriage penalty, so
Yeah.
that's going to double, and and incentives matter, obviously, Tom, because you're getting married this year. So there we go. It's proof that
Specifically because of the rumors on the
exactly,
salt
yeah,
tax.
taxes.
Yes.
Yep, there we go, there we go. If
I
anyone
w
would, you would.
You know what? I wonder if any future, lonely, economist PhD student is gonna look at the rate of marriages based on blue state, red state, salt tax, right? Then this change and see if it changed. Okay, anyway, that's a future dissertation idea for
There we go.
somebody.
There we go.
Alright, so we still don't want them to do the current policy baseline,
Oh,
gimmick?
I mean, so yeah, the current policy baseline is out of all things that have happened this year, the tariffs, everything else, I find the current policy baseline the most objectionable possible thing. Because when you think of
I have other objectives. The crazy thing is there are many things that I could put up against that, but keep going.
as far as domestic economic policy is concerned, I would actually find that's the most egregious thing. In part because the Trump administration has different priorities and things like that. But this is like reasonable members of Congress being like, let's just like ruin the one sort of semblance of spending restraint we have remaining, which is like an actual like requiring reconciliation to not add to the deficit after 10 years.
Right.
It's not a
Right.
great constraint, but it is a
But it
constraint on
is a
them.
constraint, yeah.
And if you go to the current policy baseline, then all of a sudden what you've done if you eliminate the current policy, if you go to current policy baseline, is you've eliminated the filibuster for all spending bills. That's
Right.
what you've done. And
Right.
the left would love that so much because all of a sudden we're going to enact universal daycare for 1 year, and then a week later, oh, by the way, we're going to make that permanent and it's free according to the budget rules now because current policy that's in law.
To be fair, I think
Um,
Republicans would love it too because they could just change the tax code however they want to in the same way.
You know what? You can do that for 10 years. Like, and the reality is that anything you do, and this is like, this is true to some extent on both sides, but
Anything you
Dems,
do is going to get revisited. Yeah.
well, yeah,
And spending is forever,
exactly.
almost.
And so the idea that, oh, we're going to make this temporary, or we're going to make the tax cuts permanent. You're like, no, what you've done is you've given like Democrats in 8 years a great pay for because all of a sudden it's, oh, well, rather than these tax cuts expiring and us having to like, we're not going to get any money from those. Now we can unwind part of the Republican tax cuts and get money to pay for other things, right? So they would love that game of, and you go through like the history the last few years of these budget cycles, and essentially what it is each party using the other party's legislative actions to pay for something else that they want. So, you go to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, right? They got rid of the individual mandate, and that saved them a bunch of money. The individual mandate in the Affordable Care Act, because there was an assumption there that you'd end up with spending reductions. And then the Biden administration comes in and does something similar with some of the drug price rules that the Trump administration had pushed through. And they use that as a pay for part of the Inflation Reduction Act. And then now you see Republicans saying, well, let's get rid of some of these energy tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act. And when you're like, oh, well, on the surface, like this, all these things look deficit neutral. But then you're like, no, they keep adding on to it. So each party uses the other party's spending increases to pay for more spending increases elsewhere. And you end up with this vicious cycle of just, rising deficit.
Let's not do that. All right. So no current policy baseline. When it comes to the TCJA, tax cut extensions,
TICJA.
you TICJA, hate that. What do you call it? Acronym out loud saying it. So
Initial? No, acronym. Yeah, acronym.
acronym. Yeah. Danny,
Mhm.
you and Josh Rao have written a piece about which parts to extend and which ones not. What's the quick summary on like you're looking at this going, we're going to extend some of it. What do you prefer we do?
So, I mean, I think the argument of our paper is there's a lot of parts of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that extending it's really just spending through the tax code. It's things like the child tax credit. It's, things that maybe lower people's taxes, but don't have much of an effect on what the tax rate people face. And when you think about what we need to be permanent, you want parts of the tax code to be permanent that are most impactful on economic growth. And so that's things like full expensing, allowing businesses to write off the cost of, new capital purchases. That's, lowering top marginal tax rates, because that we know has a big behavioral effect on how people invest and work. The other things, child tax credit, things like that, that's spending more than it is, genuine bona fide tax policy. And so those are things that we think policymakers should probably vote on more regularly, just the same way I want today's Congress to have to vote on, Social Security and Medicare and all these other ones that they just kind of leave on autopilot. I think we should do the same thing for a lot of these parts of the tax code. And then the part that we make permanent are ones that, businesses today will look and say, well, what's my future tax rate going to be? I need to have certainty there if I am going to be able to invest. And so that's in a nutshell, that's what the paper really is that if we can pick and choose, if we can say, let's fully extend some of these things, the parts that are growth oriented, that will affect business decisions today to hire and invest, make those permanent. And then the parts that are really just spinning through the tax code, let's make those temporary and leave it for future Congresses to decide whether or not we can afford to continue them.
I like this notion of, okay, let's do the pro growth stuff. Let's not make permanent the spending parts, the parts that are actually spending, that don't have enormous growth incentives and are just costly. Because again,
And
we
you make
don't
this a
have.
lot cheaper, right? If you do that. I mean, full expensing is essentially free after 10 years, or very close to being free after 10 years, because what you do with full expensing is you're just shifting the tax break that people get in the future when they have when they are claim depreciation, to just moving it to today. So it's a shift more than it is an actual tax reduction permanently.
I like it. All right, I want to end on just a few notes. We've had a busy month, here at Hoover. I mean, the country's had a busy month, but we hosted two conferences. One through our Fiscal Policy Initiative. It was a lot of fun. Brought in a lot of tax spending experts, economists from various think tanks and universities to sit and talk about worst case fiscal scenarios. Like, what are we worried about happening if we don't get the budget under control? Um, we've got to
It was
write up.
just filled with optimism, wasn't it?
It was a really
That's what I loved it.
depressing
Yeah,
conference
yeah.
because it was, here's what we're worried about. Here's what could go wrong. Here's what went wrong in other countries. Here's what we could learn. Here are the areas that we should probably be fixing. Any quick takeaways from that one from you, Danny? Aside from
I mean,
we
the
need to make
point of
some
the
changes.
conference really was to motivate the debt crisis, and just to ask a question of, at what point does the U.S. face a situation that could really affect its economy, affect policymakers' ability to finance national emergencies, and so the takeaways on that is pretty much everything that we've known over the years, just re-emphasize that if you don't get fiscal policy under control, you ultimately lose control of what future interest rates are, inflation, the ability of Treasury just to sell its debt in ways that investors can predict, and so all those things mean that the risk of a future debt crisis are much higher every year we don't get spending under control. And unfortunately, I think you see what's going on with this administration now, and you see the sort of marginal cuts in Doge and other places that, like, this is not going to get it done, right? Until you're willing to go after Social Security and Medicare, and do things in those programs to make sure that they're cost effective in the long term, and that the benefits are well targeted to people that are really in need. You're going to continue to have this issue. So yeah, so the fiscal policy one, it was a fun time. I enjoyed it, and
Mhm.
I think the experts in the room, we had some international debt folks in there who have kind of looked at other countries' behavior in this front, and the conclusion among everyone was pretty much, yeah, you really need to get spending under control, and unfortunately, that's not something that's popular within the Beltway, or most of
It is.
America, for that matter. So
Indeed, indeed. But whatever, we'll hold the line. That's our job. We also had a healthcare policy working group conference the week before that. It was a lot of fun. That was under Chatham House rules, so we've got a summary write up on that. Healthcare. Again, we talked about this a little bit today. It just doesn't seem like we're going to get much out of the on healthcare and the reconciliation bills. But there's a lot that obviously needs to change there too. I mean, at the end of the day, Medicare, Medicaid, ACA spending, tax structure, a lot of changes need to happen.
yeah, and I think in the healthcare space, maybe I'm a little bit more optimistic. I think there are probably room to make some changes. Great example of this is something that Paragon has done a lot of work on, the Paragon Health Institute,
Yep.
on provider taxes. And essentially, if you're unfamiliar, provider taxes are this really
Paid provider
scandalous
taxes,
things
right?
that, well, yeah, Medicaid provider taxes.
Yep.
Back in like the 1980s, states figured out that they could just tax their providers, hospitals, insurance companies, anyone else that was involved in the Medicaid program, tax them really high, get a big federal payment for that because the federal government pays for the most of Medicaid. And then they rebate the tax revenue back to the hospitals and the other providers. And so the hospitals and providers were happy because they were getting, all their money back. They weren't actually paying the tax on it. They were getting a little bit more. The state was happy because this was helping, fill their state budgets. And federal taxpayers were really unhappy, or should have been at least. And so in the early 1990s, they tried to reduce the ability of states to do this. And they included this one little provision that said, you can have small provider taxes, but they need to be broad-based and all of this. And in the last few years, states have gotten very good at figuring out ways to really increase their provider taxes. And so, things like that. California, for the last 3 or 4 years, has, they balanced their budgets on the back of what they call the MCO tax, essentially taxing Medicaid insurance companies a whole lot of money, and then having the federal government rebate it back to them. And it was so bad, even the Biden administration came out and was like, yeah, what you're doing here isn't really, in the spirit of the rules. And technically you have passed all the benchmarks. So we're going to let this happen. But, we're going to go and rewrite the benchmarks again because this is outrageous. And so, there are places where it's very clearly now anything you do on that space. I mean, and this is the hard part is that if you fix the MCO tax, all of a sudden California has a massive budget hole and a bunch of other states have a massive budget hole. And then you got some, congressional Republicans who are going back to their districts and having to explain why, the state budget is out of whack all because they voted for this reconciliation bill. So it's not easy, but it's places like that where it's very clear that, there are ample places to reform Medicaid.
Yeah. Last thing I'll mention, we've got a survey in the field right now on TCJA on the TCJA. We ran a neat survey a month ago at Hoover on tariff policy and people's knowledge of tariff policy and how it affected their support. And so we, I think in maybe 2 weeks, we'll be able to sit down and discuss what the results of this upcoming survey are on Americans' attitudes, preferences, knowledge of what tax reform options are actually being discussed and what should be done. So I'm really looking forward to that. Hopefully we can run a few more surveys on healthcare policy and basically everything else we spend money on.
Wait, there's a long list. We have a lot of things to talk about.
Government does spend money on a lot of things, doesn't it? All right, that's a depressing episode. Let's end on our veto of the week. Good old Grover Cleveland.
I'm excited.
A lot more vetoes to go through. April 4th, 1882. Vetoes an act to execute certain treaty stipulations relating to the Chinese. And I will just read this.
We just randomly picked this one, of course. This had nothing to do with it.
That's right. Here's two sentences, the key takeaway. This is from Grover Cleveland. Experience has shown that the trade of the East is the key to national wealth and influence. The opening of China to the commerce of the whole world has benefited no section of it more than the states of our own Pacific slope. As I'm sitting on, over here from California on that Pacific slope, we have benefited from trade to the East. Well, I said the East, but, over to the West side, over to China.
They're eating our lunch, Thomas. I've been told they're eating our lunch.
They're providing a lot for, they're providing cheap things for us. I really appreciate that my dollar goes further because they make things cheaper.
As Apple takes a 10% hit today, and as I'm looking at my Apple iPhone and Apple computer, I do wonder how I'm being made worse off through cheap goods from China.
Indeed. All right. That'll do it for us at 584 Vetoes. If you got feedback, send it in to feedback@584vetoes.com or find me on Twitter at TomVChurch. Danny is unfindable on Twitter, and he's going to keep it that way.
Indeed.
That'll do it for us. Closing out episode 7, 584 Vetoes. We'll talk to you next time.
Bye.
The views and opinions expressed on 584 Vetoes are those of the authors at a particular moment in time and do not necessarily represent the views or opinions of their employers or their future selves.